our sponsors this afternoon, especially McGraw-Hill Education, Western Governors University, and Discovery Education for supporting this session. You know, I think all of us in business would agree that the quality of our workforce, almost more than any other factor, will determine the ability of American businesses to maintain a competitive edge in today's economy. And it's a place where I think we all are worried about falling behind. Never before has the economy placed such a premium on knowledge, but we face a skills shortage, and it has come with serious consequences for not only our businesses but our citizens. Now, businesses have to spend billions of dollars every year to do what we call remediation. You remember the old brownfield sites where you'd have to remediate them? Well, that's the way it kind of feels now as you're bringing people in as new employees. Many companies have concluded that it's simply better to invest money elsewhere and create jobs elsewhere rather than to deal with the undereducated or the gaps in the educated workforce. It's really unfortunate. Right now, the U.S. has 3 million long-term unemployed people, but yet there are 4 million jobs that can't be filled at the moment. 4 million openings, 3 million. You go, well, what's the factor there? Well, geography is clearly one piece, but the bigger piece, of course, is a skills gap. And CED has a research project underway that is documenting promising business practices for employee post-secondary degree attainment and certification. We're also assessing incentives and impediments and looking at factors that determine what we can do differently, like business partnerships with institutions of higher education. We're pleased to present this timely session, which we've entitled The Future of America's Workforce Readiness, which represents the intersection of both business and education sectors. And it's really this intersection, this partnership that needs to happen between the universities, the broad-based colleges, and business. And it's not something that we naturally do as business people. We sort of view the university sector and the post-secondary sector as something that takes care of itself, and yet we as the business community are the primary consumers of the output of that whole system. And so we need to engage in a productive manner to make sure that our future employees are getting the skills that they need. For the first panel, we're delighted to have Dr. Robert Mendenhall as a presenter and moderator, and it's my pleasure to introduce him. Since its founding in 1999, Bob has been the president of Western Governors University, and their students earn competency-based degrees based on what they know and can do, not by accumulating a certain number of hours or credits. Prior to Western Governors, Bob applied his passion for transformational learning at IBM, where he oversaw its K-12 education division. Bob has been named Utah's CEO of the Year and has also been awarded for his immense contribution to distance learning, and CED is fortunate to count Bob among our trustees. Bob, thank you and welcome. And I'll let each of the moderators invite the panelists up and introduce their panelists. Bob, welcome. Over there.
Well, it's great to be here and appreciate the opportunity. We have a great panel, and I think in the interest of time, we'll introduce them really quickly. Maybe I can invite all of them to come up as I do that. Carl Camden is actually a co-chair of the Board of Trustees of CED, is president and CEO of Kelly Services, and well recognized in the field of talent management around the country. Also joining us will be John Leutner, who is the head of global learning and corporate HR for and organizational effectiveness for the Xerox Corporation and oversees the learning initiatives within Xerox. Thirdly, we have Linda McMahon, who is the principal and former CEO of WWE. And finally, the Honorable Stephen C. Preston, who is CEO of Livingston International, a firm that facilitates international trade, also is former Secretary of HUD and Administrator of the Small Business Administration. So we look forward to communicating together. I think the topic for our panel is really the mismatch between the skills that businesses want and desire, and what our higher education system is producing. 15 years ago, WGU was created really by governors who were hearing from employers that they were hiring graduates from the universities and then spending 6 months and $50,000 training them to do something. That refrain really hasn't changed much over the last 15 years, and that's the challenge that I think we face in higher education and that businesses face as they look for qualified graduates. Rather than spend a lot of time on the problem of the skills gap, I think we'd like to focus this panel on solutions to that problem. But let me just suggest 4 quick data points that may frame our discussion. The first is a recent Gallup poll found that 96% of chief academic officers at universities think they're doing a good job. 11% of employers think they're getting highly qualified graduates prepared for the workplace. So there's a mismatch between what higher ed thinks and what employers think. Secondly, the Georgetown Center for the Workforce projects that by 2020, 65% of all jobs in America will require some post-secondary education. Not necessarily in every case a degree, but a degree or certificate. And that, at the current rate of production, will be 5 million workers short of the skilled workforce we need in 6 years. You're familiar with the OECD data. The US used to be first in degree attainment. We've now dropped to 12th in the world in the attainment of college degrees. And finally, I would just mention a study by the Lumina Foundation. There are now 37 million adults in America, 23% of our entire workforce, that has some college but no degree. Most of whom kind of by definition are in lower paying jobs. Many of those jobs are going away and they have 20 or 30 years left in the workforce. They're employed by those in this room. Most of them are working and need additional education in order to be productive members of the workforce in the future. So perhaps we could start with our panel with question number 1. And I'll just kind of throw it open to any of you. Is there a mic in that chair over there? Can I come sit next to you instead of standing here? How can business and policy leaders work together to increase the educational attainment with workforce value and to close this gap between what employers need and what is being produced by higher education? Any thoughts on what we might do?
I can start. As I deal with universities, there is a lack of clarity on their side as to exactly what are the skills needed in the workforce and how long those skills are going to be needed in the workforce. And what we don't have, that I see again in countries like Singapore and Switzerland, are national databases that project out 2 to 6 to 10 years what are going to be the skills in demand, how that works. And that type of clarity, I think, would be useful. I think secondly, what needs to take place among policymakers is an understanding that jobs is an outdated concept. You have 40% of the workforce who basically is working for themselves. That number will be over 50%, we believe, in 5 to 10 years. And what you have is a population then where they are working for companies who don't have any, are working for themselves, and so working in a situation where there's no company who would have any responsibility for their continuous training, and working in the absence of craft unions, guilds, or other types of things that used to provide that type of discipline. And what we're not doing with the students who are graduating, and the policymakers aren't making it easy to do, is training people how to keep themselves continuously upskilled and trained. So we need an emphasis not only on getting people through a degree, but then we need an emphasis on to how do we enable those individuals to be able to provide that continuous training that they're going to need to stay in the workforce, and admit that a larger and larger part of our workforce isn't going to be housed inside companies, and therefore there's not going to be somebody who has that paternalistic role of trying to keep them employable.
I also think that, those of us who've run businesses have to take some of the responsibility for working with institutions to do that. I get a little concerned about driving it on policymakers because we're the ones that need to do the hiring, and, we're the businesses I've been involved in where we've had the greatest issues, and we were talking a little bit about this earlier, has been in many of the trades. I've worked with a couple of companies that had thousands of vehicles, for example. Finding people that could, service those vehicles is extremely difficult. Other types of trade areas. So that's certainly a situation where we would have partnerships with other organizations that would actually train those people. But the other thing we also believe is there is a degree to which we need to offer in-house training. We need to provide that support for our people, and to some degree, unless it's a specific skill that is provided externally, like a degree program or something, I do think we have to take responsibility for understanding that we have a training responsibility within our companies, and that needs to be an important part of our employee development.
So just to kind of build on some of the comments, I was actually at a very interesting symposium on Monday where we were talking about this whole issue between academia, business, individual personal responsibility. And there were really four themes that I think we ended on the day that everybody felt very confident about. We have an affordability problem. The cost of education today is spiraling much greater than most people can afford. And what was interesting that struck my attention was it's not the cost of the classroom, it's the cost that sits behind the classroom. That's tripled in just the last 5 to 7 years. The other is credentialing. We have a very legacy model in terms of how we recognize people's capabilities. And we need to find new ways in which we recognize work experience and how do we credential people with that work experience, not necessarily as the end point, but as being part of the solution. The other piece is portability. To Carl's point, as people are shifting, how do they take that set of credentials that may be very internally developed and be able to have recognition as they're applying for other jobs? There was a very interesting story that was told by a young man who had worked his way up from a call center to a very significant responsibility within the IT organization. 2008 hit, the organization went down. He was out looking on the streets for a job. And yet, given all his experience, businesses were not really recognizing his true value, what he brought. So when he tried to go back into a call center, all of a sudden it was a catch-22. He was overqualified. So, here, we had an individual that really had worked his way up, had the credentials. It wasn't simply validated through some, process. And then back to the point about business, I think I look in terms of my own career. When I started with my company, we had a very strong legacy of training as part of career development. Today, that's not a sustainable model for a variety of reasons. I think that model has shifted significantly to one of enablement. So the person has to take personal responsibility, but the organization has responsibility for enabling that learning to occur by providing the necessary tools, the necessary methods to really offer new types of learning practices that keep pace with the change that's going on in the world today.
Let me just tell you a very brief story. I don't know if someone's turning this on or, there we go. I ran for the Senate in the state of Connecticut, and when I was campaigning, I toured the state, toured many businesses and different kind of companies, manufacturing companies, from small businesses to large businesses. And I was at one company, and it was a carton manufacturing company, specialized in cases. You've seen some heavy equipment or production equipment that's moved in these big steel cases from, small ones to big ones. And I asked the owner, I said, tell me what kind of skills you're looking for and how complicated is it? Are you able to get, to your point, are you able to get a skilled workforce coming in the door? To my astonishment, he looked at me and he said, I would like someone to come in who has 6th grade math skills, who knows how to use a ruler to measure, to cut the sides of these cartons. And he said, and that's how far behind some of our education is, that I can't get skilled labor with 6th grade math skills. That's deplorable in our country. When we wonder why we've fallen so far down on degree levels, we are really, really lacking in providing a great deal of fundamental education for our students from lower grades in school up through secondary. I also serve on the Board of Trustees of Sacred Heart University, so I've seen it from both sides. Working with the business community is so important, and in speaking with the Dean of the School of Business, one of the things that Sacred Heart is doing, I think very successfully, is reaching out to the business community for what are called learning labs, so that these business students are now working with business leaders in the community, designing curriculum, not just designing curriculum, but actually working on projects so that this is applied learning. It is going to the Webster Bank Arena in Bridgeport, Connecticut, and working on a project of what is the economic impact and benefit of Webster Bank Arena to the city of Bridgeport. How do they market it? How can they process their results? And these kinds of applied learning opportunities and learning labs are really turning out students and now employees who understand the problems and needs of those businesses.
So as we look at this issue, I think one of the challenges business and policymakers still have is that we view education the way we went through it. A one-time life event that we do between 18 and 24, some of us took longer, and then we're prepared for the workforce. The truth is today, as you know, but we sometimes forget in our discussions, traditional age students living on campus, going full-time to class is less than 25% of higher education. So today, the traditional student, used to be the non-traditional student, is older, working at least part-time, often full-time, with a family. And our institutions today, I think, first of all, are not very well set up to serve that student. They don't offer a lot of classes at 10 o'clock at night. And to your point, John, we don't do a good job in higher ed of recognizing that students come already knowing things. So everybody takes the same classes, everybody needs 120 credit hours, every class takes 4 months, as opposed to, recognizing students come knowing different things. Let's demonstrate what you know, spend your time learning what you don't know. But how can businesses help transform an educational system for this different population of students? Again, it used to be we could be educated once and kind of last, and now the economy's changing fast enough that we need this lifelong learning, and we don't really have a lifelong learning system in this country. Any thoughts about that?
Well, I think I would actually just take off on a little bit of what Linda said, which is the importance of apprenticeship is so important, is so critical. And when you think about people who are right now, and I'm on the board of a couple of colleges, and we deal with this issue a lot, and you either have a lot of kids in sort of the traditional residential model, you have a lot of people doing distance learning. They both serve a purpose, but this concept of sitting in a place and then doing it later is really pretty suboptimal. And we deal with it all the time in our business, and once again, I think that's a perfect opportunity for businesses to engage with institutions where you have either young students or somewhat later in life students going through a curriculum and engaging to bring them into their organizations, take them through apprenticeships, have it be part of the learning process. I spent part of my education in Germany, which has a very, very extensive apprenticeship type learning system, and a lot of kids go through that, and it's very successful. And we just don't think that way here. It's sort of like you go through that pod and then you're sort of launched forward. The ability to adapt, the ability to understand content and subject matter, the ability to be productive is so much higher if you couple the two together. And I do think, once again, that's where local businesses should be engaging with universities or other tech schools to provide those opportunities.
Where I'm seeing success, and also deals with one of the problems that you were talking about in terms of the expensive nature of the degrees. There's apprenticeship programs, and we tend to view apprenticeship programs, we tend to semantically dump that into a category of only trades. But I'm seeing companies do a lot of successful apprenticeship programs in finance, accounting, marketing, and so on. And we need to extend the concept. And a lot of our customers, we're managing with them very successful programs where they're half-time employees, half-time students, and are being paid for that experience. And they find that there's a better retention rate among those programs. And it also deals with the cost factor, at least partly, in the education system. The other thing we need to recognize is that a lot of the larger companies are backing off of the commitments to providing continuous training for employees. We talk as if, again, out of a 1950s, 1960s model where if we train them, they will stay, and we will accrue the lifetime benefits from having trained them. And one of my children is talking to me about whether he's ruined his career because he's in his second year of employment at the same company. And all of his friends have already moved on to the next company. There's lots of HR professionals who can argue and do argue successfully that the idea of continuous investment in the employees is a bad idea. Because the number of jobs that somebody maintains, the number of different employers they work for is linearly increasing. And the millennials currently have an attitude of no more than 2 to 3 years. The college graduated millennials of 2 to 3 years at any company. But again, I think the apprenticeship programs have some appeal where you're receiving immediate feedback and immediate utility from that training, and also helping to deal with the cost factor. But let's not beat up on the companies too hard, because they're dealing with a workforce that's deeply mobile and doesn't necessarily see a lot of attractiveness to the idea of working for a single company for their entire life.
So just to kind of build on what's been said here, a couple things. If you think about it at the most fundamental level, the most significant learning experiences that we've had has been through the work that we've done. And we've really turned our attention to saying, learning is within the work. And if you start from that perspective and work backward, and you think about the work environment that we're in today, it creates a very different mental model to work from than where we came from. There's still the responsibility, I think, in terms of organizations, especially large organizations from a training standpoint, but it's a different type of training model where it's really about foundational preparation, getting people new into position, making sure that you have alignment around the vision, values, and business direction of the strategy. But from that point on, it really becomes more about learning and performance enablement. And how do I put learning at the fingertips of people that, given the work that they're doing, it's applied learning? Because that's where the engagement and that's where the relevancy comes from. We actually did a study where we found as rich a history we have with training, we got to a point that with all our training programs, within something like 48 hours, 33% of the content that we were training people on was lost, either because of retention or because the world had changed in that short period of time in terms of the applicability. So it's going almost back to understanding from a distribution standpoint, what's the objective that you're trying to achieve and how do you enable that to really not only build workforce capability, but to develop personal self-sufficiency.
Don't you think, too, as a CEO, I often found it is really difficult, more so today than 20 years ago for me when I was really just starting in business, to look sometimes in the eyes of my employees and see that hunger and their own aggressiveness, their own initiative to move forward and to move up. And I think part of what's difficult today is when you're talking about putting learning at their fingertips, et cetera, is you want somebody to reach for it as well. And how do we continually motivate that workforce? What is it within, our companies? It is about satisfaction, but it's about creating product that you want to keep them wanting to stay at your company instead of moving on. And that is more and more of a challenge, I think, with companies, to be fresh, to be innovative, to attract those young, hungry, energetic young people out of college, but also many folks who find themselves a little bit later in their career who, through no fault of their own, have been laid off from work or laid off from a job, and they need to be retrained, you know, to come into a secondary career, and they're a little bit lost at it. But if they've got the desire and they really have that interest in seeking things, that's one side that's easier to promote and teach. Then you have the other side that really doesn't even know where to turn. So from a business perspective, putting more tools or educational opportunities at their fingertips, I think, is part of what business can do. So it's kind of a twofold process.
Can I just, a quick statement? That's an excellent point, because I like to tell my staff who I work with, I said, you know, we get into this mindset that we have to train people. We have to tell them what they need to do. Yet, and I would challenge anybody, when somebody comes to the door in the morning, ask them what do they want to accomplish today. What I found is when you have that conversation, people come to work with good intentions. The challenge is, how do I execute on those intentions? And there's where I think the shift is helping people from an enablement standpoint fulfill those aspirations that they have and those intentions they have when they come to work, or if they're seeking employment, being able to fulfill that, that aspiration.
Just one more quick thing. You know, one of the, and I hadn't thought about this till now, one of the things that Kelly is lucky in terms of an alignment of everybody's economic interest. Our temporary employees can take a test and it tells them what type of jobs and assignments they can go on at what hourly rate, and then we tell them if they would possess these additional credentials, this is the hourly rate they could get to. And our online certification programs are massively used because of the alignment of issues. We like it if they can go on to a higher paid job. They like it if they can go on to a higher paid job. And I think so, you know, that alignment of interest and motivation, I think, is one of the challenges for those of us in the business world. If we're going to ask them to be dedicated and grab, which I love that, right? To, you know, I think your stories are great. The question is how do we align the economic interests of both sides for that activity to work well?
It's hard.
That's a good segue. You know, speaking from the higher education side, I think often business appears pretty agnostic to educational quality and educational cost. You know, most tuition reimbursement programs are any accredited university, you know, will provide tuition reimbursement. We don't take a position on one being better than the other. I think the partnerships tend to be fairly limited between business and higher education. That may be as much or more the university's fault as the business's fault. You know, we have at our university program councils of employers that essentially define the competencies for our degrees, and we find employers really anxious to engage in that, but struggling to really define what they mean by the competencies they need and what's expected. I think while businesses are moving away from tuition reimbursement, I think there are other ways to encourage education. For example, I mean, first of all, just encouraging it, but providing a pathway for promotions and pay if individuals gain additional education. But in particular, given the earlier comments, partnering with universities to actually recognize what's been learned in the workplace and give credit for it, so that students can get credit for that and move on to learn the additional things that they need. And really partnering more aggressively, but promoting more aggressively those programs that are preparing great workers. I know there's school districts in the country who won't hire teachers from certain education programs because they're not up to their quality. There aren't many businesses that are doing that kind of discrimination. In fact, a really interesting, and given the time, maybe we better conclude with this, a really interesting Gallup study interviewed business leaders that said the most important factor, 84% of them, the most important factor in hiring is what students know and can do. and only 9% said it was important which college they attended. But you all know it's exactly the opposite of the way we recruit, right? We go to the top colleges and recruit because we don't have a good way of measuring what students know and can do. So I think there's opportunity for business to get more engaged in the affordability issue and the quality issue in higher ed, but it requires studying what's good and taking a stand. Any final comments from the panel?
I think I'm a little bit more bullish on businesses taking more initiative, because really what I've found, at least just my personal experience, is that there are many companies in Connecticut, and I don't think we're unique in our state, that are really partnering with universities, and oftentimes, like that one particular instance, the Webster Bank Arena that I noted, and the Learning Lab, there are companies that are willing to brand their own project within the university and make some contribution towards that study, which actually is a broader way, instead of tuition reimbursement, of actually creating a program where, if you think about the most selfish interest of a business, how cool is that? I'll just go in, I'll really partner with the university, I'll help design curriculum in a learning lab, I'll turn out a couple of employees, and I'll, in the meantime, have the ability to have them in as interns or apprentices. I can really find out what they're all about. What a great way to not only get sort of the best turnout of knowing what they can do, but helping design the programs specifically for that business. I think that's just such a win-win.
Yeah, I think the issue is, and also with tuition reimbursement, is relevance, right? I'm not sure that education gap is the same thing as skill gap. You get a lot of kids who are getting educated, they're getting terrific educations, but they can't get a job because it doesn't meet the need, right? So if we've got tuition reimbursement programs, generally, those are people who want to go back and better themselves, get a degree, see more opportunity in life, but it doesn't necessarily meet our skills gap. And so I think, if you're sitting in the position of a business leader, you want to help that person grow and develop in ways that help them realize what they want, but you also want them specifically to grow and develop in ways where they can be more effective within the context of your business. And that's why I think, partnerships with educational institutions are so key, because just as you mentioned, Lynn, I think that was a terrific example. That's where you have the two meeting each other. And the other thing is, last comment, I think a lot of this has to happen local to local. We like to think, and maybe I have a different view on this because I've run two federal agencies and I'm suspicious about driving policy up here and expecting it all to work down here. I think there's a lot in making things happen local businesses working with local educational institutions meeting needs. Obviously we have a mobile workforce, but for the most part, people live and stay within their locality, and it's important, and that's an important part of community building too.
Let me just quickly add that most of these conversations are always about what can business do, for the education communities. How do we help them build academic programs and so on. Increasingly, I'm wondering if the challenge shouldn't be the same as it is in every other area that I deal with, which is, no university has ever come to me and said, here's my proposal for us to outsource all of the talent development needs that you have. Here's what we're going to do. You're going to give us your strategic plan. We're going to guarantee that there will be a steady source of those type of trained people at every turn of the strategic plan, and you will pay us for that. Instead of paying us by the class, instead of paying us by the transaction, you'll pay us for the outcome. And I think, and it's an unformed thought, but as long as we keep saying to the business community, go forth into an environment that you don't understand and help them. Okay? It's going to be like the federal government. No, in any case.
No, I think the other thing that we have to keep in mind, we're dealing with a lot of complexity here with, both systemic issues, cost issues, you name it. And we tend to want to simplify it with an either-or answer. It's either this or it's this in terms of the right way going forward. To your point, it's a shared responsibility. And I think we really need to understand the paradoxes at play here and look for what's the both and answer. Because I think, there's a triad here of responsibility between academic institutions, between business and personal accountability of the individual. And when we begin to bring those three together in a way that allows the three to be aligned and work in unison, then we are going to be successful, I think, in really establishing the innovation that we're all seeking within our society today.
I think we should throw that down for the next panel. Thank you all for your participation.